Thank you for listening to Living Our Best with Memory Loss.
Hi, I'm Bob Stryer, one of your podcast hosts. I do have mild cognitive impairment, MCI, and it was brought on by a stroke.
I'm Sue Ann Cobb. I'm one of your hosts. I have mild cognitive impairment due to having MS.
And I'm Dennis Lowe, also a producer of this podcast, and I have a diagnosis of young onset, early stage Alzheimer's disease.
I'm David Bollinger. They call me Debo. I run the equipment here so you can see and hear these guys. Welcome to our podcast, Living Our Best with Memory Loss.
The purpose of this podcast is for people to share their experiences with cognitive decline. It is not to provide medical advice. We are not doctors, and we stress that what might have worked for one person might not work for others. If anything you hear on this program inspires you to explore treatment options, we recommend you do so in consultation with your physician.
Hi, my name is Lori Stryer, and I'm so proud to say that I'm part of a very important, informative podcast. Our podcast is called Living Our Best with Memory Loss, and what makes this podcast so special are all the folks who are producing it. I am a caregiver of somebody with cognitive decline, and I'm one of the producers. My friend David Bollinger over there, or Debo as we call him, his aunt has Alzheimer's, and he's quite passionate about getting more information out to folks with some form of memory loss diagnosis. But the most important people here in this room are my friends Sue Ann, my husband Bob, and my friend Dennis. And I'll let them introduce themselves to you, let you know their age and their diagnosis so that you can officially meet on our very first podcast the folks who will be running the podcast. Dennis Lowe.
Hello, I'm Dennis Lowe. I'm 66 years old. I've been suffering from memory loss for 5 years or so. I got a formal diagnosis just last year, and it's early stage Alzheimer's disease.
Okay. Early onset. What do they usually call it, Dennis? Early stage or early onset?
Well, there are two different things. Early onset is a function of the age you are when you get your diagnosis. Mine's early onset by a year. Okay, they normally draw the line at 65, and I was 65 when I got my diagnosis, but I was symptomatic long before that. Early stage is, regardless of whether you're early onset or late onset, early stage, there are different models, but the first, like in a 3-stage model, early, mid, and late stage, early stage is,
I gotcha.
the first couple of years.
I love this podcast because I didn't know that. So I love that we're able to learn a lot from folks with a diagnosis. So thank you. Well said. Bob Stryer is my much better half. Bob, I know your age, I know your diagnosis, but why don't you tell the folks who are watching and listening?
Well, my age is 83, and I was diagnosed about 5 years ago, and it came on from a small stroke that I had. And so when they took me to the hospital, they were saying that it was probably brought on from many strokes that I had had before, which I had no earthly idea that I ever had a stroke before.
Right. So your diagnosis is
MCI. It's mild cognitive impairment.
good, but also vascular disease.
Yeah, it's a vascular frontal lobe problem. So what that does for me, it messes me up with time. I have a hard time figuring out time if I'm supposed to be somewhere at 8 o'clock, what time I'm going to have to leave to drive there and get there and back and forth. And it's a little bit ridiculous, but I get there sometimes a little bit later than I should. But that and money problems.
Managing finances.
because I've always done that and have never had any problem with it. But I guess there were times where I didn't pay a few bills, and Lori was getting called from my people that owe money and said, "You need to pay your bills." But
Okay,
I got that under control again, so I think it's okay.
okay. And we can go into more detail on that later. Same thing with Dennis's diagnosis, early onset Alzheimer's. Sue Ann Cobb, tell us about yourself.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Sue Ann, and I have multiple sclerosis. And I started noticing probably 10 to 15 years ago in very mild ways. But it became more and more obvious to me that I was having memory problems, word finding problems, and other types of processing problems. And about 40% of people with MS do have mild cognitive impairment. And so I received my official diagnosis about 5 years ago, and I am 71.
See, I never knew that 40% of folks with multiple sclerosis are prone toward MCI.
Yes. When you think about it, what multiple sclerosis causes are lesions or scarring over the myelin sheath that take care of our nerves, and those are in your brain or spinal column. And so it makes sense if you have lesions in your brain that those impulses might not travel the best way that they could. So,
Interesting.
yeah.
Again, I'm learning from this podcast, so I hope our listeners and viewers do as well. So curious. I actually know why you wanted to start this podcast, but I want you to share that with the folks who are joining us. Dennis, why was it so important to you?
Well, I get the feeling that there's a fairly large group of folks sitting in their lazy boys in their living rooms who have just gotten their diagnosis, and they're in a panic. They're in just a state of fear, regardless of what their doctor, the soothing words their doctor may have offered in their 10 minutes time. Thinking, what's going on? What's to become of my life? What comes next? So so we've got those folks, and then there are the folks who are sitting in their recliners at home and knowing something is wrong. I'm slipping. I can't do the things I did last year, last month, last week. What's going on? Where do I go? Who do I talk to? Help me. And I think there's some value in folks who are living with a diagnosis who have been through at least some of the hurdles. I mean, everybody's situation is different. And the old adage is, if you know one person with dementia, you know one person with dementia, because everyone's journey is different. But there are a number of common things that maybe our experiences can help inform y'all.
That was so well said. Go ahead, Bob.
Well, I was just going to say that I've learned something here today too, just listening to these two people. Uh, because when I got my diagnosis, I had no idea what I had. And so I immediately started asking questions and going to the internet, trying to find stuff, because the only thing I knew about dementia. Now, dementia isn't the actual disease, dementia is the overall diagnosis for many different things, like MCI, like what Sue Ann has, what Dennis has. And so, you don't really know what it's all about. And it's kind of scary, because then the only thing I heard about having dementia was, is it going to stay the way it is right now when I'm functioning? Or am I going to slowly go downhill like a lot of my people that I've seen have? Other people don't. So you just never know. But it's a scary thing. So I thought perhaps if we had this podcast, we could help people get over their fear.
And give them a sense of direction, or relate to some of the symptoms you guys have had, and maybe understand it better to seek
Well,
help.
I think I was very, I just really appreciate being asked to participate in this podcast because I think, like Dennis said, the doctor might give you the diagnosis and pat you on the back and send you on your way. And unlike if you have knee replacement, they order therapy and do all kinds of things to help you have your highest function. And so I just really wanted to be part of something that could both give people hope that you can have a very rich and meaningful life. And if we stay caught up in the fear of the future, we miss the richness that's available to us today. So I just think being able to hear people talk that have the diagnosis by several different causes. We've got 3 different causes here today in the podcast. So, and there are many, many more. There are about 350 causes of dementia or cognitive decline, as Bob was sharing, under that big umbrella of dementia or changes in the way that our brain functions. And for me, I realized that there were some adjustments I could make. And I also had feelings about having it. And I also wanted all the tools I could have that would help me remember it. And then it dawned on me that a sense of humor really helps. And you do have to remember all your strategies for trying to cope with it, which can be hard. But it's really helped me to be around other people that really understand it.
When Bob was first diagnosed, I ran to therapists. People were saying, Lori, you need help. You need to talk to somebody. And I was going to therapists, and I felt that they could not relate to me. They were wonderful, they were kind, and they were insightful. But as soon as I joined a support group where there were caregivers of folks with Alzheimer's and dementia and MCI, just that big umbrella, they could relate and I could relate. And so, if I think for me, why this podcast as a caregiver is so important is that maybe folks won't spend as much time, not to downgrade the job of a therapist by any means, but what helped me most was to find people in my similar situation. And I think that was important. And I know Debo's aunt, who has Alzheimer's, I think, Debo, would you say that you kind of followed a little bit of advice from me as to who to turn to or where to go, that we just became this network of helping each other?
Yeah, same deal. I've learned from you and those groups you go to. I definitely did some research on them, and that got me just researching in general to figure out what could be wrong with her, because she just started out of nowhere. She actually worked at UT Hospital forever, and she's a very intelligent person in the medical field, and she just, out of nowhere just started forgetting everything. So, and her kids were so terrified to even get her diagnosed. They just didn't want to.
That happens a
They didn't want to
lot.
deal with it. Yeah, they wanted to, because neither one of them, they're both moved out. She's by herself.
They didn't want to face it.
They didn't want to face it. They didn't want to, deal with the possibility of them having to move her out of her home, which they tried moving her out, but then they found out that's a whole nother ball game of. I have young children, and they're trying to take children to places and take care of her, and yeah, it was a challenge. So yeah, definitely this has helped me. You helped me get into Pat Summit Clinic to get her diagnosed. I had to hound them to do that, and they did it. They finally got her in there, and then they got the diagnosis that she has early onset. She's 68 now. We figured it out last year was when they actually gave her the diagnosis. So I just hope this is a resource for people. That's the whole goal in doing this.
I agree. Well, thank you for being a part of it, Debo. I think it's interesting. You said something a little while ago, and so Debo's aunt was in the medical field. Can you just tell me what you all did for a living? I know what Bob Stryer did, but okay, Bob, we'll start with you because I know, but give me an idea, because you owned and operated your own business. You tell me.
Yeah, I had mostly sales, but I have manufacturing. I had a manufacturing company where we manufactured things for the furniture industry. And
Furniture, automotive, decorative fabric, marine.
yeah,
I'm adding to your creds here, so you can pay me later, okay?
yeah.
Okay.
Well, when I moved here, we originally started out with a sample staple company. So I was importing staples and staple guns for the furniture industry from Germany and France. And then after I retired, started another business on the side. We were growing hemp, and which kept me busy and kept me outside. And it was a lot of work.
Very good. So it's the old saying of you have to retire to something, right? You knew that you had to keep busy and keep your mind active.
Yeah, I wasn't a golfer, so most of my friends I know that are retired, they golf. They golf 365 days a year now, which is to me very boring. So I didn't do that.
Okay, gotcha. Dennis.
For the last 10 years or so, before retiring, I did design work and high-end furniture sales. So lots of work with fabrics and finishes um, and layouts and um, designing rooms, designing homes. Uh, what happened is that because there are so many different manufacturers and there are so many different sources and there's so many different colors and so many different styles, when you compound all of those things, there's millions of different possibilities that you need to be able to bring your client when you sit down. And my memory really started to fail. I couldn't keep track of where I was in a presentation, of what designs I had offered. Um, and at that point, my employer and I decided that it was time to call it quits.
Had you had a diagnosis then?
No, no. That was in March of last year, and the diagnosis was formally in September. Um, and that's
So you saw evidence of something way in advance of your
oh yeah,
diagnosis.
yeah.
You
I mean, I
knew.
couldn't do
Right.
what I was very comfortable and very good at doing. I could no longer do. And it certainly wasn't fair to a client who was expecting to or comfortable paying $50,000 for a living room or $100,000 for a living room's, you know, furnishings and art, and could no longer do it.
Right.
So
So what's so interesting to me and what I love about this podcast is that Dennis, somebody is watching and they don't have a diagnosis and they're thinking, wait a minute, that sounds familiar. So maybe it's not due to lack of sleep or because I mean it's just it there's something wrong. There's a disconnect. Is that right?
yes.
Something that so Sue Ann, curious, what did you experience? What were you experiencing when you knew something was wrong? You had the MS diagnosis, but then now you're part of the 40%,
Right.
right? And
Right.
so what were you experiencing?
Well, my background is in healthcare. I'm a nurse, and I worked at Children's Hospital for over 20 years, and I've been a nurse over 40 years. And and you're always a nurse in your head. But what I began to see, because in the nursing profession, you usually track multiple things going on at once. And the positions I was in, I began to struggle. As much as I would write things down and as much as I would try to be organized, it was getting harder and harder. And I didn't have a diagnosis at the time, which is very, very common to start to see changes in how we're able to navigate our career, our profession, run our home, whatever we're doing. It becomes more of a challenge. And we might voice those challenges to others, but many times others say, "Oh, I forget too. Oh my gosh, I left my purse at home last week." Many people who are our friends don't want anything to be wrong with us, like Debo was saying. Your children don't want anything to be wrong with you. So that's what I began to experience, and I did retire at 62. I did another year and a half doing home health care management, but it was just like one patient at a time. It was much easier to track. And even with that, I did it for about a year and a half and stopped. I began to realize that ethically, I couldn't risk forgetting something for my patients that wouldn't do harm. So that's why I stopped my career.
Makes sense. And what I find interesting, Bob, if I ask you what were symptoms or what did you notice, I'm very curious what your answer is going to be.
I really didn't notice anything was wrong with me. You noticed before I did. And it's like I never had to write anything down. I kept it all in my head, dates, times, places, things to go and do, and I just do them. Now I have to write every single thing down. If I don't, I forget them, and they go right by the wayside.
And you know, we always say we have to handle this with humor, at least we do in our relationship, because you have to laugh. And I want to then respond to you by saying, but sometimes you forget to write it down, or when you go to write it down and you finally remember, you put the wrong date, and so it's really a catch-22, isn't it? Because do you guys experience the same thing? Dennis, Sue Ann, do you guys forget to either write it down or forget to look over at it or put down the wrong date? So curious.
Well, I'm a prisoner to my lists. So I've always used lists, and now they're absolutely essential because the simple stuff, the stuff that you never had to think about, now, I mean, it no longer it no longer comes automatically. So remember to brush your teeth.
Is it little things like that too? Really?
Yeah,
Like
it's
remember to
just
brush your teeth?
it's just little stuff that was always automatic. I mean, you never, like, it's a busy life. You never give conscious thought to brushing your teeth, or to where you put your keys, or where you put your wallet. You had a system, or whether you've taken your medications that day. You had a system in place, or you just didn't really have to think about it. Now everything relies on a system. Everything relies on notes. And very often I'm so dependent on my wife to help make sure I've done these things in a kind way. Most of the time, she'll just give gentle reminders. Have you done this yet?
Right.
So yeah.
What I love about this podcast is that someday soon, the viewer or listener is also going to get to meet caregivers. They're going to get to meet Melissa. They're going to get to meet your wife, Margaret. And Bob, they're getting to know me. That just leads me to ask you, who are your guests going to be? Who, when folks tune in for upcoming podcasts, who can they expect to see and meet?
You're going to meet folks like us that have some impairment, whether it's a bad impairment or just an easy one, but they're all wrapped up in each other. I mean, there's not to say that MCI stops here or these different diseases stop here. They're kind of all combined. And like Sue Ann was saying, there's like 300 different diseases. Well, they're not all individual. A lot of them are just combined together, and one leads into another, and that's what it's about.
We share so many of common symptoms or things we have trouble with. And I love the way Bob put it. It's like, yes, we're all under that umbrella, and we share these same things. So there's so much more we have in common than we don't have in common. We will have people just like us, as Bob mentioned. We will have experts in the field, in the healthcare field, both physicians and social workers. And we also will have caregivers that come and talk about their experience. We hope to share some strategies, and those are different for everybody. We've talked about lists, we've talked about writing them down. My problem is I write them down, but do I look at the list? Have I remembered everything that needed to go on the list? And
That's
so
Bob,
it's
yeah.
an always changing kind of thing. And again, a sense of humor if you can have it. And sometimes things are funnier, and sometimes I don't feel very funny about it. I feel bad that I've forgotten something. I just think that we are going to offer things to our viewers that we find would have been helpful for us to know from the very outset.
So well said. Yes. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And then something else I just wanted to add, and again, this is in an upcoming podcast. There's so much to talk about, but I'm fascinated by the trial that you're under right now, the semaglutide trial. I did not know it was being used for that, and I know that that's what you're on. And so I would love to also feature the latest medications, the latest trials. Dennis, I mean, that's pretty unique.
And that's something that's a trial I've been in now for about 9 months, and we'll just see. I mean, the trial's designed to go 3 years, so we'll see as changes present themselves. So
That's great. And I personally can't wait to hear and talk to other caregivers. I think that's so important as well. It's my understanding you're also doing this podcast because of the stigma you guys think that are associated with the diagnosis. Am I correct?
Absolutely. I know that part of our mantra has always been that we need to change the narrative. We need for memory loss to not be viewed as the big bugaboo, or because you can hardly talk to anybody whose life has not been affected by someone they love or themselves or a colleague. And we just want to emphasize that there's a richness and a depth to your life that you can have while you have this.
Plus the fact that I think a lot of us, when we first get the diagnosis, that we're embarrassed. We're embarrassed to tell people about it, because when you say that you have Alzheimer's or something similar, they don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to they don't know how to mull it over in their own minds, and they don't know what to say to you. And I don't want you to say anything else but to be yourself, because we can get by. We can all get by right now, but people just have to let us get by.
I think there's a much greater awareness now, certainly than just a few years ago, of dementia and the numbers of people who are suffering.
There are so many people that are affected by a diagnosis of memory loss, whether you're married to them, related to them, their spouse, child. I agree. And so that's why I think this podcast is so important. I can't wait to do this again. And thank you, of course, for tuning in.